Good morning. I'm Marilee Scott Childs, and I'm here to tell you some stories and some history of my grandmother, Muriel Brown Scott. She was called Brownie by most people, and her nursing career. That's my connection to her, and you may have known Brownie, and maybe you just heard about her. You also may have known my dad, her only child, Donald B. Scott. He was the owner of Scott & Son, and he was a county commissioner, and then he was a state legislator. So you may have known him as well, or known of him. So we were really lucky to grow up in this town with my grandma and spend so much time with her. Of course, we were her only grandchildren, so we were lucky to get all of her attention. And so in the 1970s, she wrote out her memoirs by hand, and then she asked my sister, Nanette Scott Hornbeck, to type them up for her. So she typed up Grandma's memoirs, and then after my grandma died, my mother, Lois Wood Scott, took them all to the printers and had them printed up into a memoir book. So we are just really thankful that she wrote those down and Nan typed them up and Mom put them into a book, and now we have that history of my grandmother. We also have a diary, a 1934 diary that she wrote, and she saved all the letters that went back and forth between her and my dad, Donald, during World War II. He was stationed overseas in France, and then the Philippines, and then Japan, and all those letters she saved. So we have all of those. So it's really nice to be able to have such a history of her that we can all revisit and be grateful for. She was a well-known personality in our town. She was very involved in the community. She was very active in her Methodist church, and she belonged to Republican Women, so she was politically involved. And then she loved to play cards. So she played all different kinds of cards, so she belonged to all these different card groups. And so a lot of people knew her through the card playing. And then also she belonged to a lot of different clubs, and she was very active in those clubs. And of course the nursing part of it, everybody knew her cottage hospital, and many people had been patients there. So I think that her personality was one of capability and leadership early on in her life, as well as the rest of her life. She was just a very go-getter kind of a woman, and a very serious kind of gal that got things done, a mover and a shaker. She was a strong role model for me and an influential mentor, and I am honored to be able to share my stories and history of her with you today. So Muriel June Brown was born in 1890 in Creston, Nebraska. And right out of high school, she went out to the West Coast because she had relatives out there near to Portland, and they had teaching positions, and they got a teaching position for her. And so she went out there to teach school right out of high school. Now, I understand, because my mother-in-law was from Nebraska, and she got to teach right out of high school, that when you were in high school, they would have some sort of a class that they would you would take, and then they would allow you to teach right out of high school. But my mother-in-law says that after you taught for 3 years, then you had to go back and get some more training. So anyway, that's what my grandmother did. She went right out of high school to teaching. And so she went out there And then when she came back for a holiday in 1911, she and her friend Bess were talking about going into nurses training. So Dr. Morris, who was the local MD in Creston, Nebraska, where she lived, he encouraged them to go to Wise Memorial Hospital in Omaha. Now, they originally had wanted to go to the Methodist Hospital nursing program in Omaha, but Bess was too young to be able to go. So again, Dr. Morris encouraged them to go to Wise Memorial. And so that is where she went to nursing training. It took 3 years to go through that training. And I guess that Bess had some relatives in Omaha, so they weren't down there all by themselves. They knew someone, and I think those folks had them over for dinner when they could have them come out. Muriel graduated in 1915 from nursing college, and her class was one of the first that was registered in Nebraska. When they were in nurses training, they were all called Miss. But she said right away, her fellow friends down there called her Brownie. So they had to do 12-hour shifts from 7 to 7. And they might have a couple hours off in the afternoon, or maybe on Sundays they might have 4 hours off, if possible. But here's what they had to do in their off hours. They had to go to classes, and they had to study. Now, the doctors are the ones who taught most of the classes, and sometimes they'd teach a class in the morning, and sometimes they would teach a class in the evening. So whenever they had time, then the nursing students had to be able to catch that class. So they didn't have any spare time. But when they did, there was no dating allowed of medical students or interns. And also, they did have some time to have fun. They had a piano in their parlor. I'm going to say it was probably in their dormitory. And they would sing and play. And they did little programs, like little skits to have fun. And they did real wholesome things in those days. And it mostly required just creativity and nothing bought. Or they didn't go out. They just did things that they could do amongst themselves. She was considered a pioneer of sorts, and that nurses training at that time was considered an adventure, and it took courage. Her class was one of the first to be registered under compulsory registration in the state, and her registration certificate bore the number 30. So that's how early she was getting her nursing. Now, at some point, I never could find out exactly when, but in her career, at some point, she went and did some postgraduate course in Detroit, Michigan, and that was on surgical and operating training. So she did get some extra surgical and operating education. After she graduated, she took her state boards, and then she spent nearly a year doing private duty. And about that time, Dr. Morris urged her to run a small hospital. But when she was just a young nurse out of training, she was sent out to a little town, Bamer, Nebraska, to care for the children of her best friend in high school. And those children had scarlet fever and diphtheria, and my grandma said that was pretty much a fatal combination in those days, and they tragically lost both of those children in 1 week. Now, they had called in a specialist, and they came, but with the meager medications and fewer serums in 1916, he could do nothing. And so, because these diseases were contagious, they were quarantined, and you couldn't do a funeral right then. And so the nurses would just have to dress them for burial and comfort the parents. And my grandma talked about how a nurse that was Dr. Morris's experienced practical nurse came out and helped her during that time. She was really glad of that, because that nurse who'd had lots of experience offered her courage and her moral support and her common sense, which would have been quite a bit to offer a young nurse at that time. So responsibilities were weighty in those days for a nurse. And if you were a patient and you had an ordinary surgery, they weren't going to take you to a big city hospital. The small town MD would just call up the city surgeon and have them come out. And usually they sent out a nurse the day before to get ready for the operation. And they would have been doing normal surgeries, or regular surgeries, would have been appendectomies, herniatomies, tonsillectomies. They did those in cottage hospitals. Or if you didn't have a cottage hospital in your town, then you could go to, they could come out and go into your home. So they would try to get surgeons out from Denver, if you lived here in Torrington, and Omaha when she was in Creston, Nebraska. So in 1916, Dr. Morris set up the second floor of Brownies' parents' house, right there in the small, lively village of Creston, Nebraska, as a cottage hospital. And he wanted her to supervise that for him. So it had a roomy 4 bedrooms, a bath, and a large hall, all on the second floor. And so they took the bedroom that was off the bath and made it into the operating room. And then the doctor had a staircase and a door built into the outside so that people could come up that staircase and not go through the Brown's house down below. And he hired a cook and a helper to clean. And there were 2 beds per room. There were 4 beds total and only 1 nurse on duty. Now, they weren't always full, but sometimes it would be, feast or famine. And so she would be swamped. And when she couldn't get her enough sleep because she had so much going on there, again, that same nurse, that experienced nurse from Dr. Morris's office, would come over and spell her so she could get some sleep. Now, the Creston Cottage Hospital had an operating room, and so did the Scott Hospital, a designated room. But if they didn't, like if you were in a cottage hospital that didn't have that much space, or if you were at someone's home, they had to choose the most suitable place for operating, which generally was the dining room. And so they would carbolize, which they used carbolic acid to kill all the germs. And then they extended the dining room table and patted it, and then they would operate. So the nurse would come again the day before to get ready, and they would have plenty of boiling water ready, and they would take a great big large roaster and sterilize the instruments with that. And the doctor brought a surgical pack, which was the necessary dressings, a sterile sheet, and gloves. And sometimes the doctor would bring a surgical nurse too. The local MD gave the anesthesia, which at that time in history was ether. And I don't think it was real reliable, or they weren't quite sure what it was doing at that point in time, maybe, because my grandma said they were lucky if you didn't get pneumonia. And I think that, that had some connection to the ether. So after the operation was over, the doctor and any nurses that came with him went back to where they lived, and the recuperation of the patient was up to the local nurse. And of course the local MD too, but he was often busy with cases and out on baby delivering babies. So usually it was just the nurse that was taking care of the operation patient. So near Creston lived the Scott family. And there were 2 boys, John and Mel Scott. Now, Mel Scott married a relative of Muriel's, and that's how she knew John Scott. And she said the Scott boys had Ford automobiles. She was pretty impressed by the fact that they had automobiles. So while Brownie was running the Creston Cottage Hospital, John Scott began courting her. He would drive 40 miles to go see her in Creston at that cottage hospital. And between answering patients' bells, and they would play cards on the operating table. And she made hot chocolate on the gas stove in the room where they sterilized. I thought that was pretty funny. You know she was taking care of business, though. Anyway, she was at the Creston Cottage Hospital for 2.5 years, and her appendix ruptured. Well, Dr. Morris didn't want to operate, so he tried to get a surgeon out from Omaha. But it must have been May, I'm thinking, because a big blizzard blew in and the train stopped and the surgeon couldn't get to Creston from Omaha. So Dr. Morris got another doctor from a nearby town, and that doctor had a nurse, and they came together and helped Dr. Morris. And Brownie survived due to, she felt like, Dr. Morris's attention and skill and her hardy constitution, which was not always the case, she said, as she had drains in her side. So there's always a chance or a risk of infections, and they didn't have antibiotics then. So she did talk about how it was July, so the recuperation period for operations was 6 weeks. So by the time she was still supposed to be recovering, it was July in Nebraska, which means it was really hot and humid, and she was on the 2nd floor, and there was no AC, but she did have an electric fan. So that was not a very comfortable time to be recuperating, so anyway, I'm guessing towards the end of her recuperation, she decided to go take a trip up to Montana to see relatives. But on her way back home, she stopped off in Lingle to see Mel and Lena Scott. And who was there but John Scott? And sure enough, she and John got engaged. So I want to talk a little bit about the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, because that was something my grandma had to nurse through. And that Spanish flu pandemic is the catastrophe against which all modern pandemics are measured. And a pandemic is worldwide. So this Spanish flu killed 20 million people in the world and 500,000 people in the US alone. This virus was especially quick to kill. And so far, the world has not seen a virus that severe again. Now, my grandma's recollections were that the doctor would go out to see these flu patients, and then the nurse would follow him. And I don't know the time frame. I want to say maybe the next day. The nurse would follow out to check on those patients, and they were usually dead or dying because that flu was so quick to kill. So, because again, it was contagious, they were all quarantined, there were no funerals right then, and she talked about being so thankful for aspirin and antibiotics when they were discovered, because antibiotics were discovered in 1928, and they had a huge impact on fatalities. So here's her overview of her life. In 1919, she married John Scott. In 1920, they moved to Lingle, Wyoming. And in 1923, my dad, Donald B. Scott, was born in Lingle, their only child. And then in the 1920s, but I'm not sure exactly which date that was, but in the 1920s sometime, they moved to Boulder, Colorado, and she was the assistant supervisor at Boulder Community Hospital. And they were there until 1930. And she talked about how Boulder was a small town then. And I think we can all kind of relate to that in that I know when I was a girl growing up, we used to go to Fort Collins, and it was just a small town. And now look at how much it's grown, and I'm sure that's just what has happened to Boulder as well. But in 1930, the family moved to Torrington, Wyoming. I just love this picture of Muriel and Brownie and her Donald Brown Scott, her baby, my dad. I thought this was a nurse's outfit, but I think that they just wore those kind of scarves on their head back in 1923. So Brownie supervised 3 hospitals in Torrington, and then of course the Creston Hospital back in Nebraska. But the first hospital in Torrington she supervised was the Shoemaker Cottage Hospital, and that was on West 15th, and she supervised that from 1930 to 1934. And then the second one was the Scott Cottage Hospital at 2241 West B Street, and she supervised that from 1934 until 1942. And the third hospital was Platte Valley Hospital, which is on East 20th, or what in the building we call the Elks Club building. Now, it had been a hospital, and then they had to close it down because most of the doctors went away to World War II as soldiers. And so then she remodeled it in 1942 and then reopened that. And she supervised that until 1946. At that time she was working with Dr. Sell and Dr. Reed, and the other doctors had gone on to World War II. And one of those doctors was Dr. Krall, and he wrote letters to her and to my dad during World War II. She retired from nursing in 1946, and she took care of my grandpa, who was ill at that time. So I have a Torrington Telegram article from October 28, 1942, I'd like to read to you. Mrs. Scott to reopen Platte Valley Hospital. Extensive remodeling and rearranging has been started this week in the Platte Valley Hospital building. Considerable new and up-to-date furnishings are being procured, and as soon as the building is in readiness, Mrs. John Scott will close her cottage hospital and move to the new location. With both floors arranged for hospital use, the building will accommodate from 16 to 20 beds, according to the new management, and will provide the Torrington community with a well-equipped and up-to-date hospital. Deep sewer connections will greatly improve the basement, said Mrs. Scott. It will have a modern, convenient kitchen, laundry room, bath, and dumbwaiter service. Announcement as to the opening date will be made in a later issue. I never could find out exactly when she reopened that, but I know she was remodeling it in 1942. And this is the 3 hospitals that she supervised in Torrington. The top left is the Shoemaker Cottage Hospital on West 15th. The bottom left is the Scott Cottage Hospital on 2241 West B Street. And the right in the middle is the Platte Valley Hospital, and that's on East 20th, or the Elks Club building. Looks pretty much the same. Brownie's diary of 1934 has written in August, moved into the Eaton house. Sure do like it, and so nice and clean. So originally the house was built by the Eatons, and they rented from them and eventually bought that house. In her memoirs, Brownie said, "We moved in 1934 to 2241 West B. I started taking patients for our doctors. We quite proudly called it the Scott Hospital. Capacity 10 beds, not to mention the babies in baskets, oftentimes." And she told me that their family lived in the basement, and there was a kitchen down there that they cooked at for the hospital. And then there was an original kitchen on the main floor, but that was made into the operating room. And then the maternity ward was up the steep flight of stairs to the second floor. And though the nurse lived there, Brownie lived there, the doctors would just come and go as they were needed. And my dad's cousin, Marietta Brown, was wanting to be a nurse, she thought. And so I'm sure my grandma said, "Come on down and live with us for a year and find out what nursing would be like in my cottage hospital." So Marietta's senior year of high school. She came down and lived with my grandma and her family. And then she did become a nurse after she got all that nursing experience from being or living there. She did become a nurse. So she would come home from high school, she told me, and go upstairs, and if there was a whole bunch of linen in the clawfoot bathtub, she knew that a baby had been born that day. Now, they had a mangle in the basement, a big ironing thing for sheets and linens, and also the kitchen to cook in. And they had 2 private rooms upstairs on the main floor with 1 bed in each room. And then they had beds in the dining room and beds in the living room. And after my grandma died, my husband and I bought that house. And I would be out in the yard doing gardening, and people would pull over or people would walk by and stop and talk to me. And everybody wanted to share their connection to that hospital. People had been born there, people had had their babies there, people had had operations there. And one person told me that they had someone in their family who was burnt really badly, and she took care of them there in that hospital. My mother, Lois Wood, had her appendix out when she was a young girl there. So here's a picture of the Scott Hospital with the Scott Hospital sign out in the front. And on the left, the man on the left is my dad, Donald Scott. And then the man on the right, I do not know who that is. Does anybody know who this man might be? I thought it might be Mr. Conger or maybe Mr. Tebbett. I'm not sure. So I'm just wanting to know if anybody knows and recognizes who that is. The next photograph is a picture of Dr. John Krall. And everybody knew Dr. Krall. He was one of the doctors that was in the 50s. When I was a young girl, that's who one of the doctors was. And he was there until I was in high school. So he's the one who wrote the letters to Brownie and Donald in the war, because he was in the war also. And this picture cracks me up because he looks just like his son Johnny, who was a couple of years older than me, looked when he was young. So Johnny looked just like his dad, Dr. John Krall. The next picture is of Brownie, and Dr. Sell is on the left, and that was taken in 1936. So he was working with her at that cottage hospital as well, the Scott Hospital. And on the right is the house when we lived there during the 1980s. That's 2241 West B. Now, this photograph is thanks to Terry Watson, who has shared this with me. It's a photograph probably taken during the 1960s of a bunch of local nurses, and the heading is Torrington Nurses Continue the Tradition. I just think that it would be fun. You'll probably recognize a lot of these people. They were school nurses, and so you know who they are. On the top row, from left to right, was Thelma Perryman, Jeanette Orr, Helen Phelps, Ethel Jones, Joanne Fuller. Now, Thelma Perryman was a school nurse, and Joanne Fuller was a school nurse, and I remember Joanne Fuller being up at EWC as the nurse up there. And after Joanne is Bonnie Rice, then Barbara Hort, and finally Dee Harkins. On the bottom row, left to right, is Lynn Sutherland, Maxine Korwitz, Agnes Murphy, Modesta Kelly, Betty Miller, Donna Watson, that's Terry's mother, and Barb Ellis. So that was kind of fun to see all those nurses that we've all known about. I'd like to read next from her memoirs some wonderful stories that she has told in such a warm and witty way. And just picked these out because I thought these were some of the best stories. Many amusing things used to happen around our cottage hospital, often emphasized by the lack of soundproof walls and adequate room. Anesthetics we used to use affected patients differently. Sometimes made them weepy, either as they went under or as they came out. Often made them talkative, sometimes loving, and sometimes caused them to break forth in song. We had an OB one night, she was having a baby, who had reached the stage for some anesthetic, and as she was going under, she started to sing in a loud, clear voice heard all over the house. You are my sunshine, my love and sunshine. The only way we could shush her was to let her come out enough to get some hard pains. Another day, a dapper young cowboy of 17 years, we had to put to sleep quietly and remove his tonsils. After he was back to bed and was awakening, he had the best time. He sang all the cowboy songs he knew, and then he put on a rodeo. He would call the name of the cowboy and the horse and the chute number, and after a while he said, now we will have the best ride of the afternoon. Old Strawberry Roan is coming out of chute number 10, and Bill Pogue is riding her. I bet some of you know Bill Pogue, knew who he was, and I can remember Bill Pogue lived out north of town. The next story is about the cook at the Creston Cottage Hospital. We found many things to laugh about in those days. In the Creston Cottage Hospital, the combination cook and housekeeper was very efficient and also very full of hymns. The harder she worked, the louder she sang. One morning, as we were having a rather long, drawn-out delivery upstairs, the stair door was open, and Sarah's strong voice came up to us, labor on, keep the bright reward in view. The next day, as the doctor was about to do a tonsillectomy and had the retractor in, holding the patient's mouth wide open, the doctor said, I expect we'll hear Sarah singing, Behold, it stands ajar. The last story I'm going to read to you is my favorite story, and we have named it The Peach Party Caper. Here is the Peach Party story from Brownies' memoirs. John and I rented the Eaton House in 1934 and moved in. We had a few hospital beds, but we needed several additional beds, bedding, and much more. We decided to go to Denver as John had relatives there. Warren Kittredge, and you might remember him, had said we could use his car as we only had a truck, and his wife Lois would go along. Maybe you know Lois Kittredge as well. We got started about 7 a.m. one bright August morning, and were sailing along on the Cheyenne Highway, this side of